I'm Karen Diamond, and I am delighted to be here with all of you. It says up there that I'm at Purdue University, and I was there for 22 years, but now I'm retired. I live in Maine. When I left home yesterday morning, we had 2 inches of snow that had new snow. That's on top of the old snow. I was telling somebody I garden and went outside, had to prune some bushes. I was out there with my snowshoes on, shoveling the snow so that I could get down close enough to prune. So then I flew to Chicago yesterday, which is another story. Yeah, it took a long time, and now I'm here. And thankful to be with you and to have the opportunity to talk about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and that's effective instruction in early childhood classrooms. You all have handouts that provide information about what I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to refer to some of these handouts during my talk as well. I want to provide a brief background for the context in which we're teaching and working with young children in classrooms these days, and then talk more specifically about issues related to how we are teaching. I was asked to leave time for questions, so hopefully there will be time at the end for questions, but feel free to interrupt at any time, particularly if I'm not being clear. You all know this. This is not news, but I think it's important to highlight where children are these days and to think about how much the landscape has changed since the early 70s or late 60s, when we really started focusing on early childhood in a more systematic way in this country. So that many young children are poor. These are figures from the 2010 census. Almost half the children in this country live in low-income families, which is families where the income is less than 200% of the federal poverty rate. About a quarter of preschool children live in homes where parents speak a language other than English. It may be homes in which 2 languages, English and another language, is spoken, but children are learning a language other than English at home. And mothers are much more likely to be employed than they used to be. So that we have many young children who spend a lot of time in care outside of their homes, and that's different than it was when I started in this field, and we won't talk about how many years ago that was. There are substantial numbers of children who are at risk for school learning problems, young children who are poor, and I think that we often think that these are young children living in urban communities, and we forget that there are many young children who are poor who are living in rural areas. I certainly learned that in Indiana. And now that I live in Maine, there are many similar issues related to rural poverty. Children learning English are at risk for school learning problems, and children with developmental delays. These are children who, as a group, start kindergarten behind their peers. Now, not every child who is poor, every child who is learning English or with delays starts behind. But when you look at data from the group, these are the children who are most at risk. Once you start school behind your peers, you're at greater risk for poor academic and social outcomes. When children start school behind, it's not that they're not learning. They are learning, they're not catching up. And that's the big conundrum, the big problem that I think we face is that children who are more advantaged are better able to take advantage of the new information that they're learning in school. If you know a lot of words, it's easier to learn new words. If you know relatively few words, the rate at which your vocabulary expands is slower. So that the issue is that kids who start school behind tend to stay behind. And people have suggested that if we keep doing what we're doing, there's no reason to expect that the achievement gap will ever be closed. I can't promise you that we know how to close it. I just think that we need to start thinking about what we're doing and look at evidence for what works and what may be more or less effective. Now, this is not news either. Classroom contexts are where children are learning, but what we think of as the structural features of classrooms, there is no research evidence that if you do something with the way the classroom is structured, that you improve children's learning. It's not that it's not important. It's just that manipulating structural features of a classroom doesn't seem to make any difference for kids' learning. And I think part of the reason for that is that most of our early childhood classrooms are pretty good in terms of the classroom environment, at least for publicly supported programs, state pre-K classrooms, Head Start programs, corporate childcare programs like Bright Horizons. You go into these classrooms, you go from one to the other across programs, they look pretty similar. The materials are similar. You know, we buy things from Lakeshore and community playthings, the materials, the centers in the classroom. So it doesn't seem that if we try to fiddle with the structural features of the classrooms that we're going to make a difference for children's learning. The place that we really have the opportunity to think about changing what we do is where I think learning occurs, and that's primarily in the interactions between teachers and children. This is not to discount the importance of interactions that children have with their peers, though. Peers are part of the classroom context. Peers also teach children, you learn a lot from your peers. But where we have an opportunity to impact children's learning is through the interactions that teachers have with the children in their classrooms. In research, people talk about this in two ways. They talk about interactions that are emotionally supportive and interactions that provide instructional support. Observational evidence suggests that on the whole, teachers in early childhood public pre-K programs, which is where the data are from, are pretty emotionally supportive of the children in their classroom. They provide emotional support through the way that they structure the day, through how they manage things like transition time, and also through the interactions that they have with children in the classroom. But that if you observe specific instruction, scores are lower on that measure. That seems to be much less robust across classrooms than emotional support. So I want to talk just briefly, because you all know this too, I'm sure, about how we tend to think about teaching young children. And this is, it is how I learned, it's how classrooms are organized, and it's important we tend in early childhood to adopt a constructivist perspective, and that reflects the fact that children are naturally curious, that they learn through their engagement with individuals and with materials that are available to them, that their learning should be guided by what they're interested in. The environment should be attractive and enticing and promotes children's engagement. And then the part that I think is where I want to talk about is we have often thought and interpreted this constructivist perspective to mean that the role of the teacher is to follow the child's lead. So that the teacher models, she describes, she engages in parallel play, does a variety of things where what children are learning is directed by their interests, and the teacher follows along with that. There's evidence, data. Some of it's in the IES synthesis report that suggests that when you adopt this approach, children's learning gains are smaller than when teachers engage in more planned and intentional instruction in the classroom. People often resist that approach because I think there's a long history in our field of, and it started with the first developmentally appropriate practices book where there were appropriate practices and inappropriate practices. And teacher-directed instruction was generally inappropriate, child-directed learning was appropriate. And NAEYC has moved beyond that, but I think in the field we often get stuck there. So I wanted to talk just a little bit about NAEYC position statements, because NAEYC has moved beyond this appropriate and inappropriate practices dichotomy. So this is from the 2009 position statement that focuses on both child-guided and teacher-guided experiences. So it's not just child-guided learning, but teacher-guided experiences that are planned and occur in small group and large group settings. Their position statement also says, and I think this is important given my earlier concern about children who are at risk and start school, kindergarten behind their peers, and I'm going to read this. When young children have not had the learning opportunities they require in order to succeed in school, early childhood programs need to provide even more extended, enriched, and intensive learning experiences than they do for children who have had a wealth of such experiences outside of the program or school. The position statement of the International Reading Association and NAEYC talks about the idea of direct teaching of key literacy skills. And the position statement of the National Science Teachers Association, excuse me, which is supported by NAEYC, talks about the importance of using what they refer to as elementary grade practices that are valuable for young children. And they highlight here robust content and attention to learning progressions in curriculum and teaching. So we have our national organization saying you can do both of these things. You can do child-guided instruction is important, and I'm here to say that we need to be attentive to children's interests, to what children are focused on, to what their developmental levels are, to their age, to their background, but we need to go further. So what I think of as elements of effective instruction, and when I was at Purdue, Doug Powell and I would call these the 3 E's when we were talking with teachers. The first E is that effective instruction is effective. What does that mean? That children are learning what teachers are teaching. That you have learning objectives and that children are learning the material. That instruction is efficient, so that there may be 2 ways to learn something, and you are using the one that leads to learning more quickly. The most recent example of that was in the bathroom here in the hotel, trying to figure out how the paper towel thing works. You know, what do? I mean, we take our previous knowledge, which is you put your hand underneath the paper towel. Doesn't work. Somebody says, hold your hand up in front of it. That was really effective instruction because it solved my problem. It was efficient. I would have figured it out eventually, but it was a lot more efficient than me standing there trying to look on the side of it to see if I could find a crank, you know, the whole routine you go through. So it was efficient. I think we can be another example of efficient instruction with little kids comes up with how we think they're learning new words. So that you read a book, and if you don't know a word in a book, I mean, I remember this from back in the dark ages when I was in school. Well, you're supposed to try to think about the context of the storyline and then imagine what the meaning of this word might be. And that's a good way, I mean, that's how we figure out what a lot of words are. But sometimes there are important words that you just like to know what they mean. And teachers who have thought about it, so if you're going to teach new words and explain word meanings, you have to think about what words you're going to teach, not necessarily just a word that a child may ask about, but you can help children figure out what's going on in the story effectively if you tell them what some words are that they don't know. So, efficient instruction, there are faster ways to communicate and to learn some things than to just try to figure them out from the context in which the event is happening. Then the third E is that effective instruction includes everyone, which means that there's not one strategy that you use all the time for every child in the classroom. Some kids will get it, figure it out. Some kids, it's harder for them. And so individualizing instruction, which is an important element of developmentally appropriate practices, is also an important piece of instruction that's effective. To implement instruction effectively, it needs to be intentional. So you need to plan ahead. Teachers need to have specific goals. It doesn't mean that you're tied to those goals. I mean, we all know about walking into early childhood classrooms, walking into our undergraduate or graduate classrooms, and we've got one set of goals for our undergraduate students for this particular class that I'm teaching, and then somebody brings something up, wants to go in another direction, and by golly, you change it. But you still know what your goal was. You have strategies that you were going to use to help students acquire the knowledge that they need to meet that goal, and you've planned ahead. That's what we need to do in early childhood classrooms too. The strategies, the focus is on things that are interesting to children, while at the same time we're providing instruction about important concepts. I would argue that teacher-directed instruction is developmentally appropriate, particularly when it's embedded within interesting activities that are appropriate for children's age, developmental status, and the social and cultural context within which they live. That's how we can reflect in our practice the position statement that NAEYC has about child-guided and teacher-guided learning. So where does this happen? I think, and most people think about, if you're introducing a new concept, you want to talk about a big idea to children, it tends to be introduced in group settings. It may be a large group or small group times, although there are a lot of classrooms in which small groups don't occur very often. But group settings tend to be the time that new concepts, ideas are introduced. Children don't learn something, just like we don't, with one trial. You need to practice it so that you can link group instruction with opportunities for children to practice what they're learning and for teachers to reinforce that learning, particularly for children who are struggling. So I want to talk about the daily schedule. This is an 11-hour school day. I think it's pretty typical. There's 3 hours there in which there's an hour of large group time, which is the 2 circle times. Then there's 2 hours of centers time. And and there is no time in here for transitions. So that, because it got too big on this slide, because there's a transition between everything, and so you lop 10 minutes off, at each side of it to, So there's a lot of transition time that's not on this slide. But what this gives us an idea of is, okay, in an 11-hour day, we've got an hour that's large group time. There's about 2 hours of centers time. That's 3 hours altogether, and 8 hours of other stuff, all of which is important. But when we think about, okay, we're introducing ideas, a lot of the teacher-guided instruction occurs in group times, there's not a ton of time during the day in which that's going to happen. And in many classrooms that I've seen that are full day, the afternoon time teachers tend to do more teaching in the morning and there's less structure in the afternoon. So the point of this is that not only do we need to think about how we go about teaching, but when it's going to happen during the day. And there are a lot of things that go on in early childhood classrooms that are not group time. So, how do teachers know what and how to teach? Where do you get the content from? There's curriculum, although the depressing news is that most of the research is that there's not really a broad general curriculum that research says makes a difference. But the curriculum tells us what to teach. The state's early learning standards give guidance. The Head Start standards, I mean, there are a variety of standards that tell us what children should be learning. There are research reports. The National Early Literacy Panel is on the resources list. You can get it free. It provides good information, I think. Will you click on that? And we'll see if we can get to this link, which is also should be on your flash drives. There's something called the What Works Clearinghouse. It's under IES. They offer a lot of good resources, and one of them, which I want to highlight here in terms of what and how to teach, is one about teaching math. We may not get to there. It is a practice guide. So there is enough research in mathematics, instruction and learning in early childhood that you can put it together and make recommendations to teachers about what are important concepts in math and how they should be taught. Yeah, don't worry about it.
Might be opening.
Or not. No, that's okay. I would encourage you to look at this because it's interesting, number one, but it is a really good resource for mathematics. So what to teach, curriculum, early learning standards, those sorts of things. The practice guide gives you a combination of what and how around mathematics. And then I'd argue that when teachers are introducing ideas, that when they are providing guided instruction, it needs to be planned and intentional, not just waiting for a teachable moment. Teachable moments are important, but they're not enough. We've been using teachable moments for a long time. Teachable moments were around when I started, and they're not getting the job done. Instruction needs to be embedded not only in group times, but within activities and routines, and give children opportunities to practice what they're learning. So it's not just that teachers are teaching, but children are practicing. So now I want to talk about examples. And the first one is related to teaching letters and sounds. Don't click, it's on the next slide that we need to see if we can. So I looked at your state's early learning standards, and the state of Illinois says that in pre-kindergarten, these standards include recognizing and naming some upper and lowercase letters of the alphabet, especially those in one's own name, and with teacher assistance, isolating and pronouncing initial sounds in words. They fit well with what we know from research, which is that children who know letters when they enter kindergarten are more likely to learn to read easily than children who don't. And on the resource list are two pieces by Shane Piasta and her colleagues, one of which provides evidence that we are most effective when we teach about letters and sounds together, so that when you teach the sound of the letter as well as the name of the letter. And that's because a lot of our letter names also include the sound. And the other piece looks at thresholds and suggests that knowing more than 15, the names of 15 upper and lowercase letters seems to be an important threshold for kids at the beginning of kindergarten entry. So now click on the audio thing and we'll see if we can get to this audio clip. Oh, now stop. Okay, good. What we're going to listen to now, and I transcribed it in case you can't hear it. So you should be able to have there's a one-sheet handout that's got the transcription of what we're going to listen to. This is a teacher in an urban classroom, Head Start. A majority of the children in her classroom speak Spanish at home. And she has taken the song Bingo, which we all know the words to, and is using it to teach children in her classroom about letters and sounds. So these are some of the things that I think are important about it. She's using a familiar song. She prepared the materials in advance so that she's got an easel. It says bingo across the top with removable letters, and then she's got some letters underneath it, because what she's doing is switching the initial letter in the name. She does what the research would say is important. She talks about the letter's name, she talks about the letter's sound, and the end of this tape is interesting because she's talking about the letter G, and it's clearly something she wasn't planning to talk about when she started. So let's see if we can hear this and then talk about it.
All right, let's work on our song. What song are we going to be singing?
Bingo.
Bingo. Are you ready? There was a farmer, had a dog, and Bingo was his name. Oh, B-I-N-G-O, 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 and Bingo was his name. Oh, but the farmer decided to change his name. And what letter is he going to put up there, Georgina?
B.
What letter is this?
M.
M. So what did he change his name to? What is his name, Vicente? Mingo. Now his name is Mingo. It has the letter M, but when we see the letter M, we make the sound we don't say M-go, we say Mingo, because the sound for this letter is Mingo. There was a farmer, had a dog, and Mingo was his name. Oh, M-I-N-G-O, 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 and Mingo was his name. Oh, what name should we, you know what, Georgina, hang on a second. I would like him to change his name to Tingo. What letter should we have for Tingo? Can you come up and put our letter, Jocelyn? Jocelyn was listening to the name Tingo, and she's like, that's the letter T. So she's going to put T in front. Ready? There was a farmer, had a dog, and Tingo was his name. Oh, T-I-N-G-O, 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 and Tingo was his name. Oh, what if the farmer decided his name should be Jingo? You know what, that's kind of confusing because sometimes G has the sound like J, like in giraffe, and sometimes it has the sound like G, like go. Could you put the J up for us, please, Scout? Melanie, I need you to have a seat on your bottom, please.
Yes. So that's just a part of her group time, a part of her song. I like this tape because she does such a nice job of providing really explicit, intentional teaching about letter names and sounds. The kids are engaged. You can hear that they're engaged. She's responsive to their comments, which is how she got into this discussion about the letter G, which I'm confident she hadn't planned to talk about since G wasn't up there and J was. But this is a teacher who has a very intentionally planned, explicit instruction that's embedded within an activity that's going on during large group time. It's a common activity, and she's taking advantage of what that activity that we regularly do in early childhood classrooms, taking advantage of what it affords her in terms of teaching about something that's really important, which is letters and the sounds that they make. The other thing I want to mention, I think it's in the transcript. I thought it was very interesting to listen to the kids say, oh, I think M says M, so M go. And she's very good about explaining, no, the letter M doesn't say M, it says M. She gives examples, encourages the kids to make the M sound. So she's providing a lot of instruction about letters in a way that was very engaging for this group of children. Now I want to talk about something else that's very common in early childhood classrooms, and that's sinking and floating. We do sinking and floating all the time. You want to click on that and see how long it takes to get to this? Oh, look, all right, and then you can stop. All right, so this is a sinking and floating activity. I went to YouTube. This is a YouTube video. There are many videos on YouTube about sinking and floating. They are all similar to this. It's clearly in a classroom because you can hear the other classroom noise. It's a teacher in a small group activity with these kids. So I want to watch just a little bit of it.
What is this?
A marble.
A marble. What do you think this is?
Sink. Sink.
What do you think? Sink?
It's sink.
It sinks. All right. What about this big Lego?
Lego.
What about the big Lego? What do you think?
Sink. Sink.
Float? Try it.
Float.
Kind of, look. Yeah, it looks like it's sinking.
Is it floating?
I don't know. What if we turn it over?
Sink. Yeah, we got it right. We got
Go to the
it
park today because Tony was stalking Jay. And then when I said something to Tony, Christopher gives me some mouth with the attitude of his
What
face.
about this thing?
person.
Too bad.
Sink. Sink.
You think it's going to sink or is it going to float?
Floating.
Try it.
Oh.
All right, so what are children learning in this activity? They're predicting things. They're thinking about whether or not they're right. Teachers writing it down. I mean, many of the videos that you can find show that kind of, there's one that shows you how to set up a grid and to have one side that's sinking, one side that's floating. You can put the objects that sink and float on either side. But that's a pretty sort of look at it, what happened, and then record, make a prediction, record your observation. I think you can do more with this activity. Part of the reasons I think that is because I had a student who did her dissertation on expanding sinking and floating for teaching other things, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. But first, I went to Illinois' standards again. And I would say that as sinking and floating gives you a good opportunity to address some of the science standards that are that Illinois has identified. And I picked these two that relate to using tools and carrying out simple investigations. And they're starting on that in that video that we watched in terms of carrying out investigations, not using any tools. So sinking and floating, it turns out, I learned, is really a complex concept. It has to do, you have to coordinate mass and density. And it's not something that 4-year-old children, that is developmentally appropriate to teach to 4-year-old children, a complex and complete understanding of sinking and floating. But you can teach pieces along the way, which is what we do with so much. We start with little algebra concepts and build on them. We do grouping and expand on that. So in this study, which is on your resources list, the learning goals were helping children to think about size and weight as they related to sinking and floating. Making judgments and evaluating whether your judgment was correct or not, and then doing a little study, which is figuring out what you need to do to make something that sinks, with something that floats, sink. I mean, kids, you know, and it's water and it's fun, and so we taught specific concepts and vocabulary and scientific problem-solving skills. I say we, I should say Su-Young Hong, who was the lead author on this study, did this. You have a 2-page handout that's called Examples. And what she did in this study was, it's an experimental study in which children were in small groups. They were from many different early childhood classrooms in Indiana. Children were in small groups of 3 or 4 children. The small groups met outside of the classroom for 4 days over a 2-week period. For some of the small groups, they engaged in what Su-Young called responsive teaching. And in other small groups, the teacher provided explicit instruction along with responsive teaching. So the examples, the distinction between these is on this handout. For example, the second one on the list is to teach that the heavier object sinks in water when 2 objects are the same size and only one sinks. Which means you've got to figure out what objects you're using and plan ahead. But in the responsive teaching group, this is the way we usually think about, I mean, it's what good teachers do. So the teacher tried implicitly to teach the relation between the object's weight and its floating and sinking by describing what children were doing. While playing with children, the teacher measured various objects using the balance scale, and she put 2 objects that looked similar in the water and observed what happened. In the explicit instruction group, this group here at the bottom, the teacher provided an introduction to the idea before they used the materials, so that she was trying to explicitly teach the relation between an object's weight and its floating and sinking. She had 2 pipes that were the same size. She weighed them. She had the kids weigh them. They looked at which one is heavier. They made predictions, and then they gathered the predictions, and then they tested them. And then they talked about which one floated, which one sank, whether their predictions were right or not. So that I don't have the time to talk about all of these examples, but they provide the distinction that we used in this study between what teachers usually do and what you could see that teacher on the YouTube doing without any scales, and what I think we can do by embedding explicit, intentional teaching within an activity that's enjoyable for kids. So I am talking about this study because the results are ones that fit well with many of our hypotheses. So that, and there was a third group of kids, the control group, who participated in book reading, did not have any direct hands-on experiences. So that children in both of these interactive sinking and floating groups learn science concepts and vocabulary related to floating and sinking better than the kids in the book group. But children who received instruction from their teachers learned more science and vocabulary concepts related specifically to sinking and floating than did children in the responsive teaching group alone. Children in the responsive teaching plus explicit instruction learned scientific problem-solving skills better than did other kids. One of the important things to say here, and I haven't talked at all about assessing children's learning. That is a big piece of effective instruction. I haven't talked about it because there's not enough time. I mean, we could spend hours on that topic. But this is a good place to talk about it because the outcomes are related to what the teacher was teaching. So it's not that we're looking for broad vocabulary gains or gains in mathematics skills when you teach about sinking and floating using these, with these goals and these materials. But you are looking for gains related to what you're teaching. So if you go back, and I'll return to it again, but effective teaching is children are learning what you're teaching, what your goals are, and it's efficient. They're learning more about them. They're learning them more quickly. And I would argue that this example is an example of instruction where children are learning what's being taught, and actually children in both of these groups were learning many of the same things, but children who received explicit instruction from their teacher learned more. Their learning was more efficient, and it was across the group, so that there were no exclusions of kids from this study. So it wasn't that children had to take a vocabulary test and have age-level skills before they could participate. It was anybody whose parent signed them up. So, conclusions. Go back to where I started. There are lots of kids who enter kindergarten without the skills they need to be successful at school. They are going to learn when they are in school, but they're going to be behind. And it's unlikely, all the evidence says it's unlikely they're going to catch up. There's the place that we have the opportunity to make the most difference is in terms of how teachers interact with children, our teaching practices, not how we structure our classrooms, because I think in general, across the board as a group, they're pretty well structured. But it's what goes on in them that matters for children's learning. There is evidence, it's in the IES report, that children make greater gains when they're enrolled in classrooms in which their teachers plan activities, use group and small group times for instruction, and then provide support to children as they are learning those difficult skills. And providing support means individualizing instruction. Teachers who are effective have goals. They know what they're teaching. What is the goal of this activity? Why am I doing this? And I am all in favor of activities that are fun. But I think it can be fun and learning too, and that's what we need to focus on. Teachers are intentional. They have thought about it ahead of time, so we go beyond teachable moments that present themselves to thinking about intentional teaching where we plan ahead. We use a variety of different strategies so that the way to teach science concepts and the way to teach literacy, print knowledge are likely to be different, and we're not going to use the same strategy for both. We try to use strategies that are efficient, provide opportunities for children to practice what they're learning, monitor children's progress, and I would argue that we need to monitor children's progress specifically related to what we're teaching them. It's important to have a big picture of where a child is, but if we want to know how our teaching is, if we know what our goals are, then we can say, are children learning? And we need to teach everyone. Easier said than done. Believe me, I know that. Thank you all very much. And I am happy to entertain questions, yes.
It's not a question as so much as an observation. I feel like we have a semantics problem in early childhood.
Oh, yeah, many.
And we know that we've had the messaging about the word play for years.
Uh-huh.
That people thought if you were playing, it meant chaos and running around and no structure and no learning. And so we've kind of battled that one. Now I feel like the messaging issue is those words direct instruction. And I feel like this is just a guess, but I think if you were to ask a group of teachers what does direct instruction mean, they would not describe what you just described. It would almost open the floodgates. Like, I feel like if you said to a lot of early childhood teachers, well, direct instruction is now okay.
They're good at
Then you would
things.
start to see worksheets and kids
Yeah.
sitting for half hours.
Flashcards.
Lectures. Half hours group times that were, that were being bored to death.
I know, drill and kill.
And so I feel like, I just wish, I like it better when it's called intentional
intentional teaching, explicit instruction. I absolutely agree with you. I think direct instruction.
We have to be careful when we message to our teachers and students that we're clear when we use terms, what it means.
Right, because direct instruction has a history, and I think that is a very good point, that using different words, intentional teaching, explicit instruction, planned instruction, is better than direct. Yeah,
This goes in a different direction, and I know it's just a frustration of 40 years of doing this. It's interesting to me that our children seem to be getting further and further behind, which means they start school further behind, which means in preschool we're supposed to be doing more direct instruction, intentional teaching. But that so much of that comes out of the huge change in what is the kindergarten first grade curriculum. What are we doing to kids that we are making them more behind because they haven't learned what they used to learn in second grade, and now is in first grade and kindergarten. I didn't even go to kindergarten, they didn't have it where I lived at that time. And, you know, there was no direct instruction before first grade, zero. And even then, I remember the little cutouts of letters to learn the letter names.
Oh,
But that was like, so, no wonder our kids are starting further and further behind, because what the expectation is that they already know it before they get there.
I see.
Reading wasn't part of kindergarten.
No,
I mean, it wasn't even a piece of kindergarten.
Right.
And it's so, I mean, I realize it's not really what your topic is, but I just see this thing about how far behind our kids are. How could you be behind when you get to kindergarten? That's where you're supposed to start this process. How can you start kindergarten way behind everyone else? I mean, the whole notion of that to me is so frustrating. Because we say you're gonna fail, we identify kindergarten children as failures.
Oh, we do it with preschool.
You flunked
I mean,
kindergarten, well, that's, but
I-
I don't know, there's just part of it that seems like we've got to figure out how to push back more, because.
But see, I think-
Workers have failed.
I think that if we look at what families' experiences are, and that there is a huge gap in what the resources that parents have to spend on their kids, and resources means money. Resources also means time. I mean, you know, now that I'm retired and when I was employed, I really understood what a valuable resource time is. And I think there are families that don't have lots of time. What I think is happening is several things. The population of this country is changing in ways that have added to groups of children who are at risk. There are more young children. The highest rate of poverty is among preschool children. So that there are more children who are living in families that are poor. There are more children, I mean, back in the dark ages when I started, the issue of children who were learning a language other than English wasn't an issue. We also have parents of children with resources who are providing more stuff for their kids as preschoolers. And so I think part of the issue is not just what is happening in the schools, but how that's reflected perhaps in what parents are doing, so that kids who are advantaged are starting school with a lot more stuff. I mean, I grew up in a pretty, not fancy, but sort of middle class family. And yeah, we played in the neighborhood with our friends, There wasn't Sesame Street. And Sesame Street's a perfect example. Sesame Street was developed as an intervention program designed to boost the learning of low-income kids. Who took advantage of Sesame Street? Parents and kids who were in the middle class. And what did it do? It boosted those kids' learning. And, people talk about the Matthew effect, that It's from the Bible. The rich get richer. And it is evident in lots of ways in education. Children who come in with more skills learn more than children who come in with fewer skills. It happens early on, it happens later, and it makes a certain amount of sense. You know, if you know more stuff, it's easier to learn more things. You've got more ways to connect new knowledge with what is already in your head. And so I don't disagree one bit with everything you're saying. For me, I've got to take that as a given. That's the way the world is. And I have not been effective in altering what happens in the kindergarten and first grade in any community that I have ever lived in. And so I think that there are ways that we can be respectful of where children are, of what they're interested in, and also provide more explicit teaching to them in our early childhood classrooms.
I don't know the name of the study, but I read it a couple of weeks ago in a Research Connections online email that comes in about, and this I think lends itself to how kids are behind when they did a study where children in poverty, that they were doing PT scans, etc. on them, that their brains were actually smaller than the brains of children that had more enriched, and that it comes from probably less nutrition, less interaction, and their physical brains were smaller, and that was so eye-opening to me. That
I haven't seen that. I don't have trouble believing it. Certainly, early nutrition is a critical issue for young kids, and you know, nutrition both in terms of brain development and in terms of being able to take advantage of what's going on in the classroom. So that, you know, you can stand up here and get discouraged, and you can say, okay, there's so many things that need to be fixed. And I agree, but all I can do is try to influence this little piece of it. And this is a piece. I think it's an important piece. It is hardly the only piece. And we've got to attack this problem on multiple fronts. But I think we can do more in our classrooms. And I mean, that YouTube video makes me crazy because I think it is an example of not capitalizing on the opportunities that are available. And I think that's what explicit instruction helps us to do. All right, thank you all. I will be around for lunch, happy to talk.